People think you'd know. That's the first thing everyone says to me, in the careful way people say things when they've already decided you're a fool, but are too polite to use the word. You lived with him, you shared a bed with him for 9 years. How could you not have known the man lying next to you every single night was drowning, was borrowing against your future in the dark, was watching everything the two of you had built disappear one secret loan at a time? And I understand why they ask it, I do. Because I asked it of myself for the better part of a year, lying awake at 3 in the morning going back over everything, looking for the moment I should have seen it. But here's what I've learned, and it's the only thing I have worth giving you. You don't know, because not knowing is the whole architecture of the thing. The lie isn't a single act you might have caught. The lie is a structure, built slowly, maintained daily, designed by a desperate person specifically so that the one person closest to him will be the last to find out. I didn't miss the warning signs because I was stupid, or because I wasn't paying attention. I missed them because I was being managed by an expert, and the expert was someone who loved me, which is the cruelest version there is. My name is Helen. I'm 53. I want to tell you who I was before all this, because the woman I'm about to describe is not the kind of woman these stories usually happen to, and that's exactly why you need to hear it. I'm not a lonely retiree who flew out chasing a fantasy. I'm a nurse. I spent 26 years in the National Health Service back in England, the last 12 of them in intensive care, which is a place that teaches you, more thoroughly than almost any other job on earth, to read people, to spot the thing being hidden, to notice the small wrongness before it becomes the large catastrophe. Reading distress was my literal profession. I could walk into a room and know from a person's color and their breathing and the set of their shoulders that something was failing inside them before any monitor caught up. I tell you this not to make my story sadder, but to make it more useful, because if a woman who spent a quarter of a century professionally detecting hidden suffering can live with it in her own bed for years and not see it, then please, I am begging you, do not comfort yourself with the thought that you'd be sharper than I was. You wouldn't. Love switches off the very instruments you'd need. I came to Thailand at 41, after my own divorce, but not in the desperate way. I came because I was burned out in the way that ICU nurses get burned out, hollowed by years of other people's worst days, and a friend who'd moved to Bangkok to teach kept telling me to come and remember what warmth felt like. So I came, intending to stay 3 months, and I stayed because I fell in love with the place first, and then, about a year in, with a man. His name was Krit. He was Thai, a few years younger than me, and he was not, I want to be clear, anything like the cartoon villain these stories usually feature. He didn't target me. There was no scheme. He was a genuinely lovely man, kind and funny and attentive, who worked as a sound engineer for live events and music, a real job that he was good at, and we met through mutual friends, and fell in love slowly and properly, the way grown adults do when they've both already had their hearts broken once, and aren't in a hurry to do it again. I need you to understand that the love was real, because the tragedy doesn't work otherwise. This isn't a story about a con man marrying a foreigner for her money. It's a story about a real marriage between two people who genuinely loved each other, destroyed by a sickness that one of them was too ashamed to name. Those are different stories, and the second one is, in its way, the more dangerous, because there's no obvious villain to warn you off. The danger came from inside something good. We built a real life. We married after 2 years. A small wedding, both families there. His from a town up in the northeast that I came to love. I kept doing some agency nursing and private care work. He had his events business, which did well in the good years. We pooled our money the way married couples do. A shared account for the household, the rent, the bills, the savings we were slowly building toward maybe buying a small place one day. And here is the first structural thing I want you to notice, because it's where the door was left open, the same way it always is. We shared the household account, but he handled the money. Not in a sinister way, not at first. It was practical. He was Thai, he spoke the language, he understood the systems, he knew how things worked in a country I was still, even after years, a visitor in. He paid the bills, He dealt with the bank, he managed the accounts, and I let him, gratefully, the way you let your partner take over the part of life they're better at. I knew our balance roughly. I knew what came in and what went out, roughly. I trusted him completely, and the trust was earned. For years it was completely earned, and that's precisely the problem. Trust that's been earned for years is the trust you stop examining. The very fact that he'd never once let me down was the reason I stopped checking whether he might be starting to. I think about those years a lot now, the good ones, partly because they were genuinely happy, and partly because I keep searching them for the crack I must have missed. And the strange, awful truth is that there wasn't one, not then. The good years were just good. He'd come home from a long event smelling of the stage, exhausted and buzzing, and he'd cook at 1 in the morning because he couldn't sleep with the adrenaline still in him. And I'd sit on the kitchen counter in my nursing scrubs, eating noodles at an absurd hour, listening to him talk about a band he'd mixed, and I'd think, this is it. This is the warm life I came here looking for. He was thoughtful in small ways you can't fake over years. He remembered things. He noticed when I was low after a bad shift, when I'd lost a patient, and he'd just be there, quietly, not trying to fix it, which is a rarer skill than people know. His family folded me in completely. The mother who gave me the gold chain, the sister I grew close to, the long, lazy trips up north for festivals, and the whole machinery of belonging to a Thai family that took me years to understand and came to treasure. None of that was performance. I've had a lot of reasons since to reframe those years as a long con, and I've tried, because in a way it would be easier. It would let me hate him cleanly. But it would be a lie. The man in those years was real, and he loved me, and that's not the consolation it sounds like. It's the wound. A con would have been simpler to survive than the truth, which is that real love and total betrayal lived in the same man at the same time, and I have never found a way to make those two facts sit comfortably in the same chest. The gambling was always there, in the background, in a way I didn't recognize as dangerous, because it looked like culture, like normal life, like everyone around us. I want to talk about this carefully, because it's the soil the whole thing grew in. Gambling, formal and informal, is woven through a lot of ordinary social life, in ways that a newcomer reads as harmless fun. And mostly, for most people, it is harmless fun. There were card games with friends. There was the lottery, which everyone plays, the official one, and the informal underground versions, with better odds and worse consequences. There was betting on football, on Thai boxing, on anything. Crit did all of it, lightly, socially, the way half the men we knew did, and I never thought a thing about it, because there's a vast and invisible difference between a man who enjoys a flutter and a man who has a sickness, and from the outside, in the early stages, they look absolutely identical. They do the same things. They sit at the same tables. The difference isn't in the behavior you can see, the difference is in what the behavior is doing to the person underneath, and you cannot see that, not from the outside, not even from inside a marriage, not until it's far too late. I watched my husband gamble socially for years, and saw nothing wrong, because for years there was nothing wrong, and then at some point the line was crossed, quietly, privately, in his own head, and I went on seeing the same behavior I'd always seen, and not understanding that it now meant something completely different. I can't tell you the exact moment it tipped, because he never told me, and by the end he probably couldn't have told me himself, but I can reconstruct, from the wreckage, roughly when the secret machinery started turning, and it was about 4 years into our marriage, around the time his business hit a rough patch. The events industry is feast and famine, and there was a long famine, months of it, and money got tight in the way it gets tight for everyone sometimes, and I didn't worry, because we had savings and because lean stretches pass. What I didn't know, what I would not know for years, was that somewhere in that lean stretch my husband, frightened and proud and ashamed of not providing, had started gambling not for fun, but to fix things, to win back what the business wasn't earning, to solve a money problem with money he didn't have, at a table, in a single lucky night. And that exact impulse, the gambling to recover, rather than the gambling for pleasure, is the door between a hobby and a disease, and once a person walks through it, they are in a different country, with different physics, and the most loyal husband in the world becomes, without ever deciding to, a stranger who lies. Now I have to teach you the mechanism, because the mechanism is the part that actually destroyed us, more than the gambling itself, and it's the part nobody understands until they're inside it. When you lose money you don't have, you need to get money from somewhere, and a respectable man with a wife who handles part of the finances cannot simply empty the joint account without questions. So he goes outside it, and outside the formal banking system, in the world I as a foreigner barely knew existed, there is an entire parallel economy of informal lending, and it is the engine that turns a gambling problem into a catastrophe. It works like this, and I want you to really hear the numbers, because the numbers are the horror. Informal lenders, and they range from a friend with cash to a local figure who lends as a business, to organized operations that are frankly criminal, lend quickly, with no paperwork and no questions, to people the banks won't touch. And they charge interest not by the year, the way you're used to thinking about it, but by the month, sometimes by the day. Rates that sound almost reasonable as a daily number, a few percent, compound into something monstrous. 20% a month is common. I have since learned of arrangements that ran higher. 20% a month means that a debt left unpaid does not grow. It explodes. It roughly doubles every few months, so that a loan of 50,000 baht taken to cover a bad night becomes 100,000 before you've caught your breath, and 200,000 while you're still telling yourself you'll fix it. And the only way to handle the payment on the first loan is to take a second loan. And the only way to handle the second is a third. And now you are not a man with a gambling problem. You are a man running a doomed relay race against compound interest, borrowing from one lender to pay another, the debt accelerating away from you no matter how fast you run, and every step of it hidden, because to reveal it is to reveal everything. Let me make that concrete, because the numbers are the thing people don't believe until it's them. Imagine a single bad night. 50,000 baht lost. Money you don't have. You borrow it informally, at 20% a month, telling yourself you'll clear it next month when the business pays. Next month the business doesn't pay, or you try to win the repayment back at a table and lose that too, and now the 50,000 is 60, then 72, then it's been a few months, and it's over 100,000, and the monthly interest alone is more than you can find. So you take a second loan, a bigger one, to clear the first, and for one beautiful week you feel free. The original lender paid off, and then the second loan starts its own clock, and it's larger, and the interest on it is larger, and you are now exactly where you were, but at twice the scale. That's the relay. Each handoff feels like a solution, and is actually an acceleration. The terrible mathematics of it is that there is no amount of running that wins, because the thing you're racing compounds faster than any income can grow, and the only outcomes available are confession or collapse, and a proud, ashamed man will choose collapse every time, will run until the wall, because confession means being seen, and the whole machine exists to avoid being seen. I've since read that this is textbook, that addiction counselors and debt advisors know this spiral cold, that it has a shape as predictable as a disease progression. It was textbook. It was happening in my own home, on the other side of a man's loving face, and I'd never read the textbook because I never dreamed I'd need it. And there was the gold. I have to explain the gold, because it's the most Thai part of this, and the part that, in retrospect, was screaming at me the whole time. Gold here isn't just jewelry, it's stored wealth. It's the family's emergency fund worn on the wrist, and gold shops function as informal banks and pawn shops all in one. You can buy gold when you have money and pawn it the moment you don't, getting cash against it instantly, redeeming it later if your luck turns. For a man hiding a debt spiral, the gold shop is perfect, because it's fast, it's private, and the assets disappearing are small and wearable and easy to explain away one at a time. Over the years, slowly, our gold went. The chain his mother gave me at our wedding, the pieces we'd bought together in the good years, that I thought of as our little hedge, our security. They went to the gold shop, pawned and never redeemed. And when I'd notice one was missing, he'd have a reason. It was being cleaned, it was being repaired. He'd lent it to his sister for an event. Each reason was plausible. Each individual missing piece had an individual innocent explanation. I never sat down and noticed that the explanations had become a pattern, because noticing the pattern would have required me to suspect the man I loved, and I would rather have lost a dozen gold chains than suspect him, which is of course exactly the calculation he was relying on, the one he probably hated himself for relying on, lying in the dark beside me. There were warning signs. There are always warning signs, and I had them, and I want to walk you through how I explained each one away, because your warning signs, when they come, will be just as easy to explain, and recognizing the pattern of your own rationalization is the only defense there is. His phone became private in a way it hadn't been. Calls taken in the other room, a passcode where there'd never been one, a flinch when it buzzed late at night. I told myself it was work stress, the business, men being moody. Money got tight in a way that didn't match what I knew of our income. I told myself the famine was just lasting longer than usual, that the events industry was hard, that he was protecting me from worrying. He became, by turns, irritable and then overly, anxiously affectionate, the mood swings of a man living on adrenaline and terror. And I, an ICU nurse who could read distress in a stranger across a ward, read it in my own husband as the ordinary friction of a long marriage. I noticed he wasn't sleeping. I noticed he'd lost weight. I noticed, God help me, all the physical signs of a person under catastrophic chronic stress, the exact constellation I was professionally trained to recognize, and I attributed every one of them to anything other than the truth, because the truth was unthinkable, and the alternatives were merely sad. That's the thing about denial. It isn't stupidity. It's a choice your mind makes, below the level of decision, to protect you from a reality you're not ready to hold. And it is strongest precisely in the people you'd think were too smart for it, because the smart ones are better at building the alternative explanations. There was one person who tried to warn me. Her name was Nitya, the wife of one of Krit's oldest friends, and she pulled me aside at a gathering, about a year before it all came down. She was careful, the way you're careful when you're not sure and the stakes are a friend's marriage, and she didn't accuse him of anything. She just asked me, gently, in her careful English, whether everything was all right with us, with money, because she'd heard something. She didn't want to say what, but she thought I should know that her own brother had gone through something with gambling and that the signs could be hidden for a very long time. And I did the thing. I did the thing I've watched 100 people do across a hospital bed, the thing I'd have recognized instantly in anyone but myself. I got defensive. I thanked her stiffly and told her we were fine, that Krit worked hard, and the business was just slow, and I went home faintly insulted that she'd implied anything was wrong, and I never followed it up, never asked Krit about it, never did the single thing that might have cracked it open a year earlier, when a year earlier might still have mattered. She handed me the truth, wrapped in kindness, and I handed it back, because accepting it meant accepting that my marriage was not what I thought it was, and I wasn't ready to lose that, even to save it. I think about Nitya a lot. I think she knew exactly what she was risking by saying anything, and I think I made her sorry she'd tried, and I never apologized, and I should. The end, when it came the way these things always come, which is that the structure simply ran out of room. A debt spiral cannot go on forever. The compound interest guarantees it eats itself eventually, and the only question is how much it takes down when it goes. For us, the wall was a Tuesday afternoon when I came home early from a private nursing shift, and there were two men in our living room I didn't recognize, sitting very calmly, and Krit's face when he saw me was a face I had never seen on him in 9 years, and I knew, in the way you know a patient is going to crash a moment before the monitors do, that whatever this was, it was the thing, the real thing, the thing under all the other things. The men were collectors. They were, I'll say in fairness, not violent, not in that moment, just present, just sitting in my home with the quiet authority of people owed a great deal of money, and their presence was the message. I remember offering them water, That's the detail my mind snagged on. In the middle of my whole life ending, the absurd nursing-trained reflex to be hospitable, to manage the room, and one of them accepted and the other didn't, and I went to the kitchen and stood at the tap with my hands shaking, and understood that the water was buying me 30 seconds before I had to turn around and face whatever this was. They spoke to Crit in low, even Thai, too fast and too quiet for me to follow more than fragments. And the fragments were enough. His name, a number, a date, the flat tone of men who have said these same words in many other living rooms. They were not cruel, and somehow that was worse than threats would have been, because it told me this was routine, that there was a whole established machinery here that my husband had been feeding for a long time, that we were not a crisis to these men, we were just a Tuesday. After they left, there was nothing for Crit to do but tell me. And he did. Finally, all of it pouring out of him on the floor of our living room. A grown man I loved crying in a way I'd only ever seen at deathbeds. And the number he said, the total, when he finally got to the total, did not sound real. It sounded like a number from someone else's life. I want to slow down on the discovery itself, because it wasn't one number. It was an archaeology, a dig that went down through layer after layer over the following weeks, each one worse than the last. The first number he told me, the men in the living room number, turned out to be just the most urgent debt, the loudest one, not the whole. Over the following days, as I forced the full accounting out of him, and then, not trusting his account, went looking myself, the real shape of it emerged. There wasn't one lender. There were several, a whole web of them, layered on top of each other in that doomed relay I described. New debt taken to service old debt for I genuinely don't know how long. Maybe 2 years, maybe 3. The savings we'd been building toward our little place were gone. Had been gone for ages. The account I thought held our future actually drained and then maintained at a deceptive trickle. Just enough that the occasional balance I glanced at didn't scream. The gold was gone. All of it. Every piece. Pawned and lost. He'd borrowed against the business. Against equipment, against future bookings. He'd borrowed from his own family, quietly, his sister, an uncle, sums they couldn't afford to lose and now had, which meant the wreckage wasn't just ours. It had spread out into people I loved, who'd been keeping his secret too, ashamed on his behalf, hoping he'd recover before I found out. When I finally sat down, late one night, with a pen and a piece of paper and forced myself to add up the whole thing, every lender, every family debt, every drained account, the total came to something north of 2.6 million baht, which at the time was around 60,000 pounds, against a marriage that had, 4 years earlier, been quietly, modestly solvent and pointed at a future. 60,000 pounds, lit on fire at a series of tables over a series of nights by a man who would have died for me, and instead, slowly, killed the thing we had. One secret loan at a time. I added it up the way I'd assessed 1,000 patients, coldly, methodically, because the coldness was the only way to keep from drowning. And at the bottom of the page, the thing that broke me wasn't actually the money. I want to be honest about that. The money was catastrophic, and the money mattered, and the loss of our future was real. But the thing that broke me, sitting there at 2 in the morning, was the realization of how long he had looked at me across our kitchen table, our bed, our life, knowing all of this, carrying all of this, and chosen, every single day, for years, to lie, not once, daily. Every ordinary Tuesday he'd made the choice again to keep me from knowing, and I'd kissed him goodbye and gone to nurse strangers back to health, while my own home burned in a way I was professionally equipped to detect, and emotionally determined not to. The betrayal wasn't the gambling. Addiction is a sickness, and I came, eventually, to be able to hold that. The betrayal was the structure of lies he built around the sickness, and the fact that the central load-bearing wall of that structure was my love for him, my trust, my unwillingness to suspect, which he used, had to use, against me, every day, to keep the whole thing standing. So what happened to us? People always want to know whether I stayed, as though the answer settles something. The honest answer is complicated. I didn't leave that night, or that month. He was sick, genuinely sick, and some part of me that had spent 26 years caring for sick people could not simply walk away from a sick person I loved, however much damage the sickness had done. He swore he'd stop. They always swear they'll stop, and they often mean it with their whole hearts in the moment, and meaning it has nothing to do with doing it, because it's a disease and not a decision. We tried. He got help, of a kind. There are services for problem gambling here, more than people realize, support groups and counselors, and he went, and for a while it held. But the debt didn't go anywhere just because he stopped feeding it. The debt sat there, enormous, compounding, and the pressure of it was its own constant temptation toward the one thing that it always promised, falsely, to make it disappear in a night. He relapsed. Of course he relapsed. And the second time I found out, smaller than the first but unmistakable, something in me that had been holding the marriage up finally set the load down. Not in anger, just in exhaustion. The way you let go of something you've carried so long you've forgotten your arms could feel any other way. We're separated now, not divorced. The legal and financial tangle of that is its own slow nightmare, but apart. I moved into a small rented place not far from the hospital I went back to, and the strangeness of starting over alone at 53, in a city I'd come to as a married woman, is hard to put into words. I'd built my whole life here around being half of something, and now I do my shifts and come home to a quiet flat and cook for one. And the quiet is the thing that gets me, because I associate quiet with him not being able to sleep, with the kitchen at 1 in the morning, and now the quiet is just quiet. I went back to full-time nursing partly for the money, obviously, the rebuilding, but partly because the ward is the one place where I still know exactly who I am and what I'm doing, where my training works and my eyes work and there's no man I love, bending reality just out of my sightline. There's a bitter irony I sit with often, that I'm good at my job again, sharp again, reading my patients again, the instruments all working perfectly, now that the one person who jammed them is gone. I'm in my 50s, rebuilding a financial life I'd thought finished a decade ago, the modest little place we were saving, toward now something I'll be lucky to manage alone before I'm 70, if at all. That's a real grief, separate from the grief about him, the loss of the future itself, the version of my old age that had a paid-off home and a husband in it and is now just gone, foreclosed, spent at tables I never saw. I'm back to nursing more or less full-time, in my 50s, rebuilding a financial life I thought I'd finished building a decade ago. The small place we were saving for now a thing I'll be lucky to manage alone before I'm 70. He's living with his family up north, still in treatment, last I heard doing better. And I hope it's true, I genuinely do, because I never stopped loving him, I just stopped being able to survive inside the love. The debt is being slowly, painfully managed. The informal lenders mostly settled at terms that were brutal but final. The family debts being repaid out of guilt and obligation by both of us, across a marriage that no longer functions. It's not a clean ending. There isn't one available. There's just two damaged people and a long arithmetic of consequences. Here is what I have for you, and I've thought hard about how to say it so it's actually useful and not just a wound on display. The first thing is the boring, structural, marriage-saving thing, and I wish to God someone had said it to me at 43. In any partnership, no matter how much you love and trust the other person, you must both be able to see all of the money, all of the time. Not because you're suspicious, because financial secrecy is the medium in which this particular catastrophe grows, and you can starve it of that medium with nothing more than transparency. Separate awareness, even with shared accounts, both names on everything, both sets of eyes able to look, anytime, at the full picture, the savings and the debts and the gold and all of it. It is not romantic to insist on this. It feels, when things are good, like a small insult to a love that's doing fine. But it is the single thing that would have caught us years earlier, when years earlier could still have saved us, because a debt spiral cannot survive being seen, and the only reason ours grew to £60,000 is that it was never, ever seen. The second thing is harder, and it's about the warning signs, and I say it as the woman professionally trained to read them, who missed them all. Learn the difference between a hobby and a sickness, because it is not in the behavior, it's in the function. A person who gambles for pleasure can stop and does stop and feels fine stopping. A person who gambles to fix something, to recover a loss, to solve a money problem at a table, has crossed a line that you may not be able to see from the outside, but that you can ask about, gently, directly, before the lying machinery is fully built. And learn the signs of a person under hidden catastrophic stress, the secrecy and the sleeplessness and the mood swings and the weight loss and the money that doesn't add up. And when you see that constellation in someone you love, do not do what I did and reach for the gentlest available explanation. Reach for the hardest one and rule it out properly. If someone who loves you both takes the enormous risk of pulling you aside to warn you, the way Nataya did for me, do not get defensive and hand the truth back. Sit with it. Ask the question. The worst that happens if you're wrong is an awkward conversation. The worst that happens if you're right and you didn't ask is everything I've just described. And the last thing, the thing underneath all the rest. Addiction makes liars of people who are not, in their hearts, liars. And the lie it builds will always be load-bearing on your trust, because your trust is the strongest material available, and the desperate person will always build with the strongest material to hand. So the love that makes you not want to check is the exact thing being used to keep you from checking. I don't say that to make you cynical. I say it so that you can do the impossible, kind, clear-eyed thing, which is to love someone fully and still keep your eyes open, to trust them and still be able to see, to hold both at once the way I never managed to. He didn't gamble away our future because he was a bad man. He gambled it away because he was a sick man too ashamed to be seen. And I let it happen, not because I was foolish, but because I loved him too much to look. Love him and look. That's the whole of it. That's everything I know now that I'd have given anything to know then. Love them all the way, and look anyway, and understand that looking is not the opposite of love. At the end, looking is the only love that could have saved us, and it's the one I didn't give.